welcome to Off the Page. There's a sailboat race that begins in Europe, in France. A sailor would leave, sail south, circle Antarctica, and return back to home port. And if the icebergs and the horrendous winds and waves are not enough, you'd be required to do this alone. Toronto lawyer Derek Lundy has written a book about this particular race called the Godforsaken Sea, and he's here in the studio today. Hi, Derek.
Hi, Leslie.
Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
First, tell us the origin of this very strange and dangerous sounding race.
It is both strange and dangerous. The first long distance, or the first circumnavigating single-handed race took place in 1968. It was the invention of a couple of crazy Englishmen. It was called the Golden Globe race, and it was pretty much a disaster. Out of 9 starters, 1 finished. One of the competitors, who was ill-prepared, committed suicide during the race after filing false reports about where he was. Another competitor committed suicide sometime after the race, partly because of the stresses of the event itself. So after that, nothing happened in the non-stop, single-handed, around-the-world scene for the next 20 years until 1989, when it was revived in France, and the first Vendée Globe round-the-world race was held. The one which I write about, which took place in 96, 97, was the 3rd running of this race.
Now, what sort of individual would want to take on this challenge? I mean, from the sound of it already, it sounds like maybe we're talking about people who are not necessarily mentally stable.
Well, I think that's a natural conclusion to draw. Mm-hmm. And in fact, before I started researching the book, I think I had something of the same idea myself. But in fact, when I interviewed about 8 or 9 of the sailors who had sailed in this Vendée Globe, both French and English, and when I talked to them, I found myself talking to people who were remarkably sane, centered, psychologically and emotionally integrated people, and I realized that they have to be to withstand the emotional rigors of being alone under those extraordinarily stressful conditions for anywhere from 3.5 to 5 months. And I guess the other element too is that they're professional sailors, and in order to run this race, it takes a lot of money. They have to raise the money from sponsors, and so they have to convince sponsors that that they're sane enough for the sponsors to entrust $4 or $5 million with.
Do they have psychological tests that some of them literally take for their sponsor?
Not that I know of. No, I actually never raised that. They do they do analyze their sleep patterns, so they do a certain amount of testing. Many of them do that.
Sleep would be a problem.
Sleep is the problem.
Is it?
Yeah, it really is. Sleep deprivation is a constant in the race, and especially as the racers enter the so-called Southern Ocean, the sea to the north, to the south of Australia, Cape Horn and the Cape of Good Hope, and north of Antarctica, the great body of water that they sail through for anywhere up to 6 weeks. Getting sleep is really tricky. I mean, the best they can hope to do is snatch a 15 or an hour and a half here, an hour and a half there, but still they become tired and they stay that way.
Human beings are not physically and mentally designed to undertake such a race.
No, they're not. But they're probably not designed to run sub 4-minute miles either. But they do. I mean, you have to remember, of course, that the people who sail the Vendée Globe are the elite of professional sailors, and they are professional sailors too. I mean, they've been sailing in sailboat races around the world or in the North Atlantic and around the world races for many years, most of them.
And this is their life.
This is their life. It's the way they make a living, and it's the thing they want to do. And of course, they've developed formidable levels of skill and coping mechanisms as well to deal with lack of sleep and the stress.
Tell me about the geography again. I just sketched it out really, really briefly, but take us out of France.
Okay.
Around and back. Just
around
real
and back.
Quick, just the geography.
Much faster than they do.
Yeah.
They leave a town called Les Sables d'Olonne on the Vendée coast of France, hence the name of the race, in November, early November, which is winter there, but they leave in winter in the northern hemisphere so that when they do sail through the Southern Ocean, they'll be sailing through in the southern hemisphere summer. Sailing through in the winter would literally be suicidal. So they leave Les Sables d'Olonne across the Bay of Biscay. They swing out past the Canary Islands. They head in a southwesterly direction to cross the doldrums, the area of calms around the equator.
How do you get through there if there's no wind or relatively little wind?
Well, these are these are fast boats, and I mean they can spread huge amounts of sail. And
just a puff, the slightest breeze is going to move you a bit.
They'll ghost along, that's right. But mainly, of course, they use their very sophisticated weather information and route. Some of them have computerized routing software that they use.
To seek out the wind, if necessary.
To seek out the wind, that's right. So they do find their way through, although sometimes they experience calms. It's the passage through the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic is the difficult tactical part of the race. In the Southern Ocean, you just hang on and hope for the best. So they cross the equator, and then they swing in a wide arc around the South Atlantic High, which is another area of calm, relatively light and calm winds in the South Atlantic. Then they begin the long swing to the southeast, south of the Cape of Good Hope, south of 40 degrees south into the Southern Ocean. And this is really the guts of the race. It's the Southern Ocean is the extreme southerly part of the Pacific, Indian, and South Atlantic Oceans, a vast sea area. They sail through ice or areas where icebergs and growlers are around. Constant strong winds, huge waves, storm after storm. They sail south of Australia, south of Tasmania, and then across the southern Pacific and around Cape Horn. And then they begin to swing north, duplicating in mirror image, I guess, the tactics of their outbound course. Up the coast of South America or close to it, and then swinging across the doldrums and towards the European coast and beating back against the westerlies and then gradually churning with them into Les Sables d'Olonne again.
How does someone recover after that race?
They seem to do a lot of drinking after the race. That was my observation. Well, they're tough people. Yes. Nevertheless, you do, I think, have to have a period of recovery. All of the people I interviewed said, in effect, you don't come back unchanged from a race like this.
Absolutely.
I think you have to. I think they have problems after being alone for so long. In one way they crave company, but in another way it's a huge intrusion on the little world that they've constructed for themselves and lived in for so long.
I know that when Joshua Slocum from Nova Scotia, the first man to sail single-handed around the world, returned from that voyage, I think he had an extremely hard time ever fitting back into life on land at all.
Yes, so I gather.
You talked about the winds. Just how strong are those winds they're encountering in the Southern Ocean?
They can be very strong. They can blow at over hurricane force in some of the more intense depressions.
You continue to sail under those conditions?
Well, they continue to move. I wouldn't call it sailing.
Okay.
At a certain point, a storm, an ordinary storm, becomes what sailors call a survival storm. And at that point, the sailor is more or less run out of room to make independent decisions. And has adopted storm tactics, which in the Southern Ocean essentially means running off before wind and waves, hanging on and praying to your maker, I suppose. So they just keep going when the weather is bad. That's the direction they're going in anyway.
But these are large boats. These are large vessels that look to me to be impossible for one individual to keep an eye on everything and to have control over. This is all in the design?
Yes, they're designed specifically, of course, for one person to sail. I mean, these boats are purpose designed for these sorts of single-handed races. I agree, they're huge boats, and I mean, they can set up to 5,000 feet of sail in good weather. I mean, vast amounts of sail. I mean, you could move a clipper ship with that amount. But they're set up with autopilots. Remember that they're steered automatically by the autopilots probably 98% of the time, yes. Or 90% of the time, I suppose, and probably all the time through the Southern Ocean. And again, it's just a matter of organizing things on the boat so that you can actually handle the sails yourself. And again, these are people whose skill levels as sailors are just way beyond the amateurs.
That's right. And that's interesting. You're talking about this professional sailor, but I'm still thinking of a very fallible human being out there. What do you do when things go wrong?
Well, things often do go wrong with these people, and it seems they they're very tough. They handle it. They endure terrible discomfort and near-death experiences when they have to. They're great at fixing things. I mean, they're extraordinarily skilled at putting things back in order and
or jury rigging.
Jury rigging, exactly, that sort of thing. So they manage, but sometimes they don't. Of course, I mean, sometimes people are lost.
That's right, as in the race that you've written about here.
As in that.
The other factor, along with the wind, the waves, the ice. What kind of ice are they up against, and do you actually have to steer around icebergs, this sort of thing?
Well, I mean, they have radar, and radar will pick out the bigger bergs, but the danger is the smaller bergs and the growlers, which float.
What are they?
Almost submerged. It's just a relatively small piece of ice that barely shows above the surface. I mean, it may be as big as a car or a tractor trailer, but there's not much of it above the surface. But it's certainly big enough that if you run into it, especially surfing down a wave at 20 knots, you're done for. Boats have hit ice in previous races, and they hit ice in this race as well, although not catastrophically. Two of the racers had rudders damaged by growlers. But they spend a lot of their time sailing through areas where ice drifts.
Yeah.
They see ice frequently. They know they can't see the bits that might get them, but they keep going nevertheless. And in fact, there's a compulsion to go further south where the ice is. The further south you go, the shorter the distance to the Horn,
of course.
But the more ice there is.
What about the relationship between one sailor and another out there? I mean, obviously, they're all, after you get out of France, out of the Bay of Biscay, you're not all crowded together waving to each other as you go. Is there any interaction that takes place at all between one vessel and another?
Yeah, there's a great deal of it, in fact, because these boats are wired in. They can fax each other. They email their websites. I mean, they're really connected electronically,
Yeah.
physically completely isolated, but connected electronically, and they do spend a lot of time talking to each other. And indeed, it's as you can imagine, it's a very tight community. It used to be a brotherhood, but now women sail, so it's much more than that, a sodality or a collective of like-minded people. And of course, they depend on each other very often when sailors have got into trouble in these races. They're so far away that shore-based ships and planes, even long-distance planes, cannot reach them. And it's a part of the ocean where there are very few commercial vessels. So very often they've had to rely on other competitors, and as was the case in this race as well.
But if it is a competition, and if you have people who feel like cutthroat competitors out there, do they not occasionally say, well, I won't pass on this information about this ice or this physical situation here or another? Does that not happen?
I don't think it might. It's possible. But I doubt if it does. I think when they get down there into the south, where the dangers are the danger is immense and palpable, I think they feel that they're all in it together. And I think that I would be very surprised if any of them would not pass on information about a storm on the way. In fact, I followed the race through the bulletins issued by the Vendée Globe organizers on their website. And the reports were filled with sailors calling other sailors and saying, I've just had a storm come over me, 50 knots, so you can expect it in about 12 hours' time, be careful, that sort of thing, or I've seen ice here. I mean, they certainly do that. I can't imagine, in fact, that they would not share the information.
So there is that kind of camaraderie out there, alone on the sea.
Very much so.
You're watching Off the Page. My guest today is Derek Lundy. We're talking about the Vendée sailing race around the world by way of going around Antarctica, and we're going to come back to some more of that right after this.
This series is brought to you as a public service by Mount St. Vincent University.
Hi, and welcome back to the show. My guest today is Derek Lundy. His book is called Godforsaken Sea, and we're talking about sailing race around Antarctica, around the world. Derek, who foots the bill for this race? It's not a cheap weekend affair.
It certainly isn't. It's expensive, although by the standards of round-the-world races, it's actually the bargain basement race. But still, we're still talking about several $1 million at a minimum for a campaign that has any chance of winning.
And what do you win if you win?
Well, you win a certain amount of money. I think the winner in the last race was awarded $90,000 US. Not nearly enough to induce me to do that. But what you win, I think, is the glory in France in particular, where this sport is immensely popular. You become a hero, and indirectly, of course, you make money because you can endorse products, business ventures, like any star athlete in anywhere else in the world, in France and in Britain to a certain extent as well. Probably in Australia, New Zealand, where this sort of sailing is very popular. You know, you do make money along the way. But that isn't why they do it, of course.
Of course, yeah. And back to the psychological dimension, which is there something in this race that is like the quest, the dream to do something that seems almost humanly impossible? Is there an element that goes beyond the nuts and bolts of making every part of this ship work?
Definitely. And in fact, I think that's where the real motivation lies.
What kind of a quest is it?
Well, it's partly a quest to recapture the experience of being in danger, and it may be a sort of a quest for to revisit the chemical charge that you get from the adrenaline, the dopamine, and so on, which the exhilaration of being in danger and coming out of it. Yes. The sort of thing I think that all extreme sport practitioners feel, although they only do it for an afternoon or a few days at most. This is for months at a time. Perhaps I use this analogy as well. The soldier in combat. It's a horrifying experience, but the body tends to crave a repetition of it because of the intensity and vividness of it at the time.
When you interviewed some of the players, some of the sailors here in this very dangerous game, did they speak about that, or did they keep that kind of close?
They spoke a little bit about it. Another thing that they did speak about, and I think this is another thing you were alluding to, is the Southern Ocean itself. I mean, it can be a terrible place, but it's a beautiful place too. And I think I spoke to Catherine Chabot, one of the two women in the race in Paris about 3.5 months after the end of the race. And she said, when I came back, it took her 5 months to sail it. She said, when I came back, I thought, never again. I will never go into the Great South, as the French call the Southern Ocean, again. And she said, but now, when she was talking to me, she said, now, all I want to do is go back. And she laughed and said, why? Well, the answer is the South, the Southern Ocean, this huge, untouched wilderness, the last great wilderness on Earth. There's something about being in a part of the Earth, and we think of the Earth as a small place now, but in the Southern Ocean, I think it must feel the way it used to when the world truly was a vast place. And you feel that again there, I think, that sort of untouched by man wildness and serenity as well.
Very elemental, very cut off from civilization, right down to communication to some extent. You're alluding to the fact that you get yourself in certain positions there where radio isn't going to work.
Well, it's actually the long range, it's the weather forecasts, which the satellites don't pay much attention to the Southern Ocean because no one's really concerned with it. Yeah, who's there? Their communications devices do continue to work there, although things on boats break down, of course, so in fact, often they don't work, but that's because they're at sea, not just because of the Southern Ocean. So
what happens in a true emergency? Somebody capsizes, someone loses a mast, that kind of thing. What does the individual do, and what backup system kicks in?
Well, if it's just a dismasting, most of these people, because they're all of them, in fact, because they're professional sailors, will jury rig something and get to port on their own steam. A capsize is something different, and if they do get into trouble that they can't fix, if they stay upside down or the boat's damaged, the first thing they do is set off their EPIRBs, the satellite emergency beacons, and then the search and rescue centers receive the information and get things going pretty quickly. They look around for assets. That might include freighters going by if they're close enough to Australia, and the Australians, in fact, tend to rescue one or two of these people virtually every race. They get them involved, but often it's just another competitor who must do it. As in fact, one of the most dramatic incidents in this race was the rescue of a French sailor who was capsized and his boat was sinking by one of the English competitors.
And there was a Canadian in this race who did not survive.
He didn't, that's right. Jerry Roos, a Montrealer.
Tell me a bit about his story.
Well, he was sailing right in the middle of the Southern Ocean, about 2,500 nautical miles equidistant from New Zealand and Cape Horn. What sailors sometimes call this area the hole, because this is the part of the Southern Ocean which even long-range aircraft cannot get to and get back, if they want to get back somewhere anyway. So he was completely on his own. He was in a terrible storm, and communication with him. Each boat has a transponder which beeps continuously the boat's position, a satellite device. His transponder, his Argos transponder, stopped working, and that was it. He just completely disappeared from sight and sound. The consensus at the time was that either he'd had a communications failure and was still sailing along, or he'd hit an iceberg and had just disintegrated and gone down, because whatever happened, he didn't have a chance to set off his emergency beacons.
And that's never been fully resolved?
Well, it has. In fact, there were news reports recently that the wreckage of his boat was found along the South American coast, and that's really just the last chapter of an earlier sighting of the boat last July, in fact, floating about 400 miles off the South American coast, intact, upside down, but intact. So that means that he didn't run into ice, and it narrows his fate down to really one of two possibilities. He was lost overboard, swept overboard by a wave, and his boat capsized, or he was on deck when it capsized and he was drowned on deck. But either way, it was fairly quick, I think.
This does not necessarily discourage the next challenger in the race?
It doesn't discourage them, but they have a very complicated reaction to it. They know that whatever happened to Jerry could happen to them. I mean, they know it's dangerous and that they could die. But still, when someone does die, it's a shock. And they're a very close group, as I said. And Jerry, in particular, was a very amiable and well-liked man. So I think it was tough for them to accept his death.
You quote Robert Burton from his Anatomy of Melancholy in the book. That's always been one of my favorite books.
Yeah.
It's sort of this large, weird, wonderful book about everything. But the quote was simply, "What is a ship but a prison?" What's the effect of that prison on its prisoner? Because even the most optimistic of these sailors must feel that at some point.
Yes, boats can be very claustrophobic. You're right. You can be in the middle of a limitless wilderness and feel intensely claustrophobic. I think that's one of the stresses that they have to deal with, especially in bad weather, when they're really the only place for them to safely be is down below in their cabins. And the cabins on these boats are tiny. I mean, I was on a couple of the boats where I couldn't stand up, and I'm not particularly tall. There's a couple of berths and a one-burner stove and a bucket.
So you hunker in down there and you wait for the storm to do what it's doing to you?
You pretty much hang on. I mean, they keep navigating, they keep watching the weather that's coming, and perhaps make some effort to nudge the boat in one direction or another to avoid the worst of the whatever system they're in. But they pretty much just hang on and hope for the best, I think, when the weather's really bad. Yeah.
Would you want to be there with that individual riding shotgun?
No, I would not.
We're going to take another short break, and we'll be back with Derek Lundy right after this.
If you'd like more information about this program or any of the courses we offer at a distance, call us or visit our website. We welcome your comments.
Hi, we're back. We're talking about the Vendée Globe race, sailors sailing around Antarctica, around the world. Is it justifiable, this whole race, the cost and money?
I think there are irreconcilable differences. There will always be people who say it isn't, and there will be people who say that it is, that this is a reflection of the best in human beings. It's part of humanity, of the human spirit.
Okay. Derek Lundy, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Leslie.
And I thank you for watching Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice. I'll see you again next time.